Welcome back, Hnrs. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the radical phase of the French Revolution, right? So we left off in class right before the start of break discussing what the heck is going to happen to France after the death of Louis XVI in 1793. January of 1793, to be more specific. So we left off in class talking about all that stuff, and I know that seems like forever ago, and that's because we've been off for the last week as I'm literally wearing one of my Mardi Gras shirts, right? It's like a whole thing. I know, all right? But I will see y'all again on Tuesday, all right? And it's important to remember that you are going to have a quiz on the content of this flip on Tuesday, right? Including this slide, right? Including this slide, okay? So the stuff that we talked about in the last class before our break started, going to the end of this flip, it's gonna be a short 10-question quiz just to make sure everybody's staying on point and doing what they gotta get done, right? And also just to give you a heads up, your last test will be Monday. Not this coming Monday, but the one after that right before we actually start exams, okay? So just give you a heads up. And I will also post your study guide for all that stuff tomorrow so you can get to work on that and you'll have a solid week to get all that done, okay? So keeping all of that stuff in mind, we're going to pick right up where we left off in class, and we're going to keep this flip nice and short. We're going to see how much we can get through in about 15 minutes, okay? So let's go ahead and get after it. Who is in charge? What is going on? And Louis the King is now dead, right? So what we left off on, though, is Louis's execution via this new little toy down here on the right that we'll actually get to here in a minute is going to be ushered in by this thing now known as the Committee of Public Safety, sometimes referred to as the Montagnards, depending on what part of the French Revolution you're talking about. But when we started discussing this, France is now a republic. They abolished the monarchy following the September massacres, where they pulled all those priests out into the streets, well, mostly priests anyway, and it was a massive massacre that went on through the streets of Paris, right? So Louis is going to be executed, and incoming is the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety being made up, of course, of these three gentlemen right there, Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, right? And so we started discussing their big role and how they acted now as a de facto wartime monarchy and how they're going to use public executions to scare away what is referred to as counter-revolutionaries, or people that were going against the revolution. They're going to purge and execute most of the Girondin Club because they themselves were Jacobins who loved the idea of using violence to get their goals accomplished. And we also left off in class talking about their new little toy, the guillotine, right? And the guillotine was going to be a whole thing, right? It's going to be painted red to hide the blood. It's going to be actually like usher in 17,000 documented executions that we know of from the time period of 1793 to 1794. And the big question of is why was it brought into play, right? We talked about that in class, and if you didn't actually have that, the reason why it was brought in by the Committee of Public Safety is because it was considered more egalitarian, right? We talked about that in our last class right before break, where we discussed how literally public executions of poorer people and in people in lower classes were much more vicious and awful. One of the most famous examples of this being called breaking on the wheel, right? And we talked about that whole thing and how they were used as examples to try and prevent poor people from doing the things that could be like were crime offenses at the time, right? And so they're also going to very much execute poor people versus rich people in a very different way. The guillotine, on the other hand, that was actually brought in is going to be used because it's considered more egalitarian, right? The idea was supposed to be that it is going to execute everybody regardless of their class in a swift, fail-proof, very quick motion, right? Now, the thing about what we are now in with the guillotine post Louis' death, Committee of Public Safety is in charge. It is known as the radical phase of the revolution that spanned from 1793 to 1794, but a lot of people in regular day call it the Reign of Terror, right? The Reign of Terror is its more colloquially used identification, right? Most people refer to it as the Reign of Terror. Mr. Peabody and Sherman refer to it as the Reign of Terror, right? The Reign of Terror is actually a very good descriptive title as well of this short amount of time, because literally what was the Committee of Public Safety doing? Using executions and fear to scare off counter-revolutionaries, all right? And sometimes people just abbreviate it as the Terror, right? So going into it so we can understand why it was such a pivotal moment, the Reign of Terror is really, really important because it is defined as a period of remorseless bloodshed and repression and extreme changes in France, okay? What they are using is fear as a design tool. They are using fear as a method to try and keep people quiet and also keep people from cropping up against the revolution. This is going to lead to people like the Marquis de Lafayette refusing to come back to Paris, right? Because we also need to remember France was at war at this time, right? They were at war with Austria, Prussia, and a couple of the other people in the earliest war of the First Coalition. And also, literally, the Marquis de Lafayette will turn himself over to Austrian forces because he knows during the Reign of Terror, if he goes back to Paris, the Committee of Public Safety will probably purge and execute him as well, seeing him as a royalist sympathizer, all right? So keep all that stuff in the back of your mind, that even one of our biggest and most majestic heroes, Stanga, is going to turn himself in with his hands up and be like, I'm not going back to Paris because I fear Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, right? But what we have to also understand is that extreme changes factor, right? What are these extreme changes that are coming into play during the Reign of Terror that is actually changing the very fabric of French culture at the time during the revolutionary period, okay? So some of these changes include, first of all, they wanted to basically leave all of the old France behind. So they're going to literally say to themselves and tell everyone in Paris during the Reign of Terror, the new National Assembly being led by the Committee of Public Safety is going to say, well, we are no longer in the year 1793. We are now in year 4, right? Because actually the revolution started in 1789. So they basically are saying that France did not exist before 1789. And then part of that, they're also going to rename all the months and the days of the week, all right? All months would have 30 days. They'd rename a bunch of the months after what kind of how hot it is outside. For example, the middle of July to the middle of August would be named Thermidor because it was so hot. We'll talk about the Thermidorian reaction here in a few minutes. But also all the months without 30 days. And also what they're going to do is a really big one. What you need to do me a favor and highlight this one is they all but cancel Christianity, right? So what they do is they actually start a program known as de-Christianization in like France at the time during in the 1790s during the Reign of Terror. What they do is they literally create a new church that they call the Cult of the Supreme Being, and they literally say the Catholic Church is not welcome here, and neither is the Christian Church as well. They create basically almost like an agnostic new religion that is supposed to be like the new glue and fabric of the religious relationship between the French people and the state. They close churches, they drop Sundays, and they change all the weeks to 10-day weeks with only one day that's a weekend, right? And so there were 3 weeks within each day, week of 30, or within each month of 30 days. They wanted to turn Notre Dame, which is the most famous church in all of France that has recently just reopened, into a shopping mall because they were like, well, we don't need a word for church anymore. And then they also are going to set the price of bread, which is a very early example of price controls, which is going to be a really important thing coming up later on, because something that's going to come out of the French Revolution is a government interventionist strategy and also philosophy on government rule and economics, known as socialism, that actually does take set price controls actually from this early phase of the Reign of Terror. That does not mean that they're connected necessarily, but it's something that they do. And then also they're going to draft men of France to fight in the war, all right? The war that they are currently in, called the War of the First Coalition against the Austrians and the Prussians, they're going to draft every single man over the age of 18, and I think below the age of 25, I think. I'll have to look that up. I'm not positive about that number. But they're going to draft them in this thing known as the levée en masse, right? Which actually means the drafting of everyone that is actually able to go serve in the military. They will be forced to go, right? So as you can tell, these extreme changes are going to instill all that idea of fear and terror, right? And Robespierre would have anyone executed that opposed these changes or opposed the revolution. And so this is going to be a massive moment that defines the Reign of Terror in and of itself, right? Being led, of course, none other by the new Republic of France and the Committee of Public Safety. Everyone is starting to get thrown in to a whirlwind of an era, if you will. Now, looking at this, though, as well, is we've got to understand with each other is there's no way that everybody was on board with this, right? There's no way that everybody in France was really cool with them purging and executing the entire Girondin Club, with them actually executing somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,000 people in total of documented executions that we know of, right? There's no way that they were okay with these arrests going on and this basically state of fear that was ruling over the entirety of France. So we see a lot of really, really intrinsic moments that are going to happen during this time period where some people are going to start getting assassinated, right? And one of the most famous assassinations that happens during the earliest phases of the Reign of Terror is none other than the stabbing and assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, right? Jean-Paul Marat, the sewer rat journalist, right? Of course, that we talked about, the guy that had to sit in that medical bath for hours on end every single day because of the skin condition that he contracted from hiding in the sewers of France. That right there is him after his assassination. This actually actually is a very famous piece of art that I absolutely love. It's one of my favorite artworks of all time. It's by this guy named Jacques-Louis David. And the death of Marat is meant to try and show Marat as almost a Christ-like figure, right? It's supposed to like be glorifying him, making him look good. But it also serves as a really, really great testimony to this moment during the Reign of Terror, right? Because a woman is going to be the one who assassinates him, right? Her name is Charlotte Corday, right? Charlotte Corday actually literally has a meeting with him, and she is a Girondin sympathizer. And what he is not aware of is that she has a knife that she bought at a market that day hidden inside of her dress, and she goes in there to have a meeting with him to discuss with him names that should be added to his list of people that should be executed and published in his newspaper. She goes and has a meeting with him, and she takes that 7-inch blade out of her dress, and she stabs him in the clavicle right there one time. Goes BAM! And kills him, right? And instead of running away after he's been executed, or not executed, assassinated, and all the blood literally drips into the bath that he actually sits in, she does not run. She instead stays there and gets arrested willingly, right? Yeah, she actually literally just stood there and was willingly arrested, knowing that there was no point in running. She's better off just waiting for her entire thing to go down, waiting for her punishment, right? Because other famous people that will be executed during this entire time period is Charlotte Corday herself. Charlotte Corday is actually one of the most famous executions that happens during the Reign of Terror, because she literally on trial, when they were asking her, why did you do this? What was your motivation for executing our Jean-Paul Marat, one of our heroes of the revolution? She said, I killed one man to save 100,000, right? And she firmly believed that the terror that was sweeping through France was going to cause more bloodshed and heartache than it was going to do any good, right? Another famous person that's going to be executed during the Reign of Terror is none other than Marie Antoinette, right? Marie Antoinette would be seen in October of 1793 as a useless vestige of the monarchy, and they would put her on trial for treasonous crimes against the people of France. And also another really messed up charge as well about apparently assaulting her son and stuff like that. But what's going to end up going down, though, is she actually will be executed as well. Her head would be shaved. She would be brought to the actual gallows, and she would be executed via guillotine. Her last words were, I'm sorry, when she actually stepped on the executioner's foot, right? Another famous one, too, if you're actually in chemistry class with Miss Holmes, is Antoine Lavoisier, which was actually a very famous chemist at the time, who actually discovered most of the known elements at the time, along with his wife. He also was a farmer general. He was a tax collector at the very beginning of the revolution before it actually started, and so he actually was being punished along with a lot of the aristocrats that didn't get out alive. Another famous one that gets actually executed as well is Georges Danton. Wait a minute, Mr. Terry. That doesn't make any sense. He's one of the members of the Committee of Public Safety. Why would he be executed? He is actually executed by Robespierre, because Robespierre is beginning to get very paranoid, right? He's getting very paranoid, and he's beginning to see any criticism or different take on his ruling style as an assault on his integrity and as something he just cannot trust. And George Danton began to actually present different ideas about like ending the terror or bringing this to a close, or maybe let's stop executing everybody. That just makes us a little bit upset. And so Robespierre has him executed as well for conspiracy to go against him, right? And so these public executions that are actually going down were considered very educational, which is absolutely wild. Women were encouraged to bring their children with them and knit in the crowd. Little toy guillotines were actually handed out to the children in the crowd at the time so they could actually try and create a positive relationship with the execution device and the Reign of Terror itself. The Committee of Public Safety is going to arrest over 300,000 people during the Reign of Terror. 10,000 of them probably died in prison, from what we understand, and 17,000 were officially executed, bringing up the number to conservatively about 30,000 that would die during the Revolution. But the most famous execution of all executions during the Reign of Terror is none other than Maximilien Robespierre himself, right? Actually, Maximilien Robespierre will fall subject to the Reign of Terror and be executed himself, because we have to understand something, is that everyone doesn't want to keep doing this. The Reign of Terror, the way that Maximilien Robespierre wanted it to exist, was just flat out unsustainable, right? And the biggest thing that you need to know for your quiz that's coming up is it's unsustainable because people are eventually going to grow tired of bloodshed and carnage, right? They don't want to see people being executed en masse for years on end, right? So the actual Reign of Terror is not sustainable because people want to get to a point where they can just go about their daily lives again, where they can just go to the grocery store, where they can actually get to a point where their government is functioning in a civil manner rather than trying to use fear to scare off counter-revolutionaries during a time of war. right? So everybody just kind of grew tired of it. And the Committee of Public Safety died when Robespierre died. And when the entire thing went down, a group of men are going to arrest him during that hot month from the middle of July to the middle of August, during that month of Thermidor, known as the Thermidorian reaction, when he was actually going to be arrested. Fun, interesting fact about his arrest when it actually went down, his brother leapt to his death out of the window of the Hotel de Ville that you can see right there. And according to Robespierre, he took a gun and stuck it in his mouth and tried to kill himself, but it didn't go quite right, and he actually ended up shooting the bullet out of the side of his face. So there's an inaccuracy about this picture when he actually went to be executed, and there was a hole in the side of his face where he actually literally shot the bullet out of. And so his last words were just like, "Arr!" And he was screaming in pain when they took the bandage off of him, and his jaw went and just kind of fell down. Really gross. So what's going to end up taking over after the Committee of Public Safety dies off when Robespierre dies is a 5-man executive branch known as the Directory. And that is the Directory phase of the revolution. Now, we don't talk about the Directory phase of the revolution here just because it's super boring and I don't want to talk about it, right? So the thing about it that you have to understand is a 5-man executive branch. Basically imagine it as 5 presidents operated together with a legislative body called the Council of 500, right? And so they tried to bring peace and sustainability to the revolution and tried to bring it to an end. A lot of people refer to the Directory phase as being the end of the revolution because France is choosing to focus on war and the changes gained by the revolution rather than just all this carnage and bloodshed. But what's going to end up happening, though, is in the background of all this craziness and in the background of all the crazy stuff that was going on, is we're going to see the rise of a man by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, who's going to be very, very important to the progression of things in France. And unfortunately, we got to do one of those things where we're jumping backwards in time a little bit, right? Because we are now entering into the phase of Napoleon Bonaparte and his rise in France and how he will eventually become the new leader of France during their revolutionary process, right? So we have to kind of jump back in time a little bit when we're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte because he's been there the whole time. Whenever France went to war with Austria, with Marquis de Lafayette, Napoleon's in the army, right? He's in the military when all of this is going down as an artillery officer and things like that. So when we jump back in time and understand where this guy came from and how this dude would go from being a soldier to being the leader of France, right? And overthrowing that thing called the Directory and installing himself in power, we have to understand where he come from. First and foremost, he's actually not even French, right? He's not even French at all. He's actually born on the island of Corsica, which is an island off the coast of Italy out in the Mediterranean. He actually grew up speaking Italian, not French, right? His original name is also not even Napoleon. It's Napoleone Buonaparte, right? Because as we can tell, he was an Italian family, not a French family originally. His relationship with his parents is going to be a really big thing that we talk about in class as well because he had a very close relationship with his mom, not so much with his dad, because his dad is actually going to be one of the people that fights against France when they come in to take over the island that he grew up on, right? France will take them over. He surrenders as a part of that army, and Napoleon apparently never forgave him for that and was never okay with the fact that his dad relented to French control, right? And so also what's going to end up happening is his father also enrolls him in a very prestigious military school at the age of 9, right? So he actually leaves Corsica and goes off to France at the age of 9 years old, where he goes to military school, and his entire story keeps progressing forward. But we're going to talk about all that stuff and where he comes from and who he is and how he will one day rise to become Emperor of France when I see y'all in class on Tuesday, all right? So we'll have a little quiz, a little 10-question quiz on some of the stuff that we talked about in this flip. Remember that first slide as well is going to be used, but I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.